So what's NephCure doing? You're doing a lot of patient outreach. NephCure is providing funds to enhance the FSGS clinical trial that we have, and so that's been a wonderful partnership. But I think the most important thing NephCure is doing is advocacy. Why do I think that's the most important thing? You can advocate. We can't. Those of us who work for the government cannot lobby the government. We'd be fired. So we have to depend on you to do the lobbying. And again, while FSGS or other types of glomerular diseases may be your focus, you need to lobby not just for that disease, but for more research dollars in general. So arguing for a bigger piece of a smaller pie is actually not very productive. What we need you to do is advocate for a bigger pie so that we all then get a bigger slice of that pie. And NephCure has been terrific, I know, in its advocacy, and I would like to encourage you to please continue with that, because we can only work with the dollars that are allotted to us, and we can't ask them for more dollars, but you can. So I'd like to just summarize here. Advances in diagnosis and treatment will impact patient outcomes, and we certainly within the NIDDK have found NephCure to be a terrific partner to work with in trying to make these advances. And I think together we can look forward to much improved outcomes. And I'll stop here and try and answer any questions.
When you say advocate for a bigger pie, what are the different ways that come to your mind as to how to do that?
Often what different advocacy groups do is they lobby Congress. And what you do is you'd rather, at least in my opinion, rather than saying you need to have the NIH study more about FSGS, I think the better approach is you need to give the NIH a bigger budget, because in so doing there will be more money to look at FSGS as well as other diseases. Unfortunately, what happens sometimes in the way this process works is if you get someone who's very vocal and goes to their congressman and says, we need more money for disease X, what will happen is Congress will then tell us, you have to put more money in disease X. In the meantime, they haven't increased our budget, so then we've got to pull that money from somewhere else, because if they write it down in congressional language, they're obligating us to do it. And to my mind, that defeats the purpose of making the healthcare better for everybody.
A recent article of the New York Times made a big point. The most aggressive advocacy group in the country is juvenile diabetes.
Right.
And they, as a result, get the biggest slice of the pie.
They have a huge slice of the pie.
Based on that practice that I've seen in the New York Times. What advice can you give us? Now that we want to be as aggressive as juvenile diabetes, we can never be as aggressive.
That is one of the things that I perceive as problematic. Because they are so vocal, and because they insisted on having such a huge piece of the pie, there are what we call these set-asides that are specifically for diabetes research and even specifically for type 1 diabetes research, which is what you see in juveniles. The applications that come in have to go through the same peer review process. And you have to figure out a way to, quote unquote, spend the money. And so, you know, if you put aside a huge chunk of money, but there are not enough meritorious applications to fund during that fiscal year, the money goes back to the Treasury. It does not go back to the NIH. It does not go back into healthcare. So I wouldn't advise that that's the route to go. I think that is problematic.
Can you talk about the importance of the program announcement for glomerular diseases and how it fuels research even beyond the dollars included in the announcement?
The way program announcements work is it's a way of letting the community know that this is something in which we're very interested. Sometimes you'll get people who they're mulling over an idea in their mind, and they're wondering, should I send in an application? I wonder if the NIH is interested in this. Program announcements are a way that we let people know, here's a priority, here's something we're very interested in, we would really like to see lots of application in this area. Now, they've still got to go through the same peer review process. It's not an automatic pass because you've sent in an application on that topic that you'll be funded. It's still got to be reviewed. But the hope is that you stimulate a lot of very good applications because you've now said this is something that we are definitely interested in. Yes?
Some of you may know me through I'm Roxanne Udrivia. I work in Washington on advocacy for NephCure, and I wanted to thank you for bringing up advocacy in your discussion. And I think I was just wanting to bring up the fact that we are advocating for 5% increase for all of the NIH.
Thank you.
Very seriously, and agree with you on that.
That registries were actually brought up at the workshop as well. And registries are an excellent idea. One of the things we've actually been struggling with at the NIH is how do we fund something like a registry? Because it's not your typical research grant. And we've been struggling with, if someone sends in an application to say, I want to start a registry on this, it's very hard to review that in the same way you review a grant to do something in the lab or a grant to do a clinical trial. So we've gone back and forth in terms of discussing whether we need a mechanism that's different than our typical research grants for funding registries. We have funded a few registries, but often those have been in the context of, this is my grant application, the first thing I'm going to do is establish a registry, and then the next thing we're going to do is do X trial on this group of patients. So they incorporate it as part of a more standard research grant application. But we're still struggling with whether or not we can come up with a mechanism purely for funding registries, because certainly for diseases that are rare, a registry is what you need to get that base and figure out where the patients are and better define the patients when you want to move on to a clinical trial. Yes?
I'm wondering about the grant for clinical research. I'm wondering if you are granting grants based on a collaborative effort between multiple physicians and who can write an application, shared agenda, like what kind of experiment design they will share. Or you're giving out as individual investigator or physicians who would write an application as a good agenda.
Okay. So your question is, do we fund just clinical applications that are collaborative efforts as opposed to individuals with clinical applications? We do both. And it just depends on the topic. The FSGS trial that you're about to hear about is a collaborative effort. And we specifically wrote it that way. We wrote what we called a request for applications and stated in that what we want to do is a multi-center trial. This is going to be a collaborative effort. But you get individuals who will come up with an idea on their own and submit an application. And if it's favorably reviewed, those are funded as well. So we do both. It's not an either or.
So for the individuals, what's your requirement of patient numbers?
It depends on the study you're doing. Part of the question was, for an individual, is there a requirement on specific patient numbers? It depends on what you're doing. As I indicated, you can be doing a small pilot study that doesn't require a lot of patients. If you want to do something bigger, then you define that. And of course, as with all of these applications, you have to have a statistical part of that that shows that the number of patients you're talking about studying is justified. And so when that application is reviewed, that's taken into account. You know, if you're saying that you're going to study 10 patients with disease X and make a huge conclusion about that, obviously something like that's not going to review very well. At the same time, if you're saying you want to look at 1,000 patients, but it's very clear from the application that you don't have access to 1,000 patients, that won't review well either. So you've got to propose something that's realistic and something that you can justify.
I guess because you're working for the government, I'm wondering if there's a database that has all the central data for patients, including different diseases, kidney disease,
No, there's no database specifically like the one that you are asking about. What we do have is the USRDS, the database where I showed you the trends with increasing kidney disease, and that now we're seeing a turnaround. And those are publicly available. You can pull those up on the internet. And what that tracks, just patients on dialysis. That's for end-stage renal disease. We do not, at least through government sources, have another way of tracking. I mean, Medicare has some information, the USRDS has some information, but in terms of just general across the board, there isn't anything. The USRDS is not, for example, going to have information on people that have chronic kidney disease but have not yet reached dialysis. Okay. Yes?
Is there any type of website that we can go to or to find out information about pilot studies? If there's something coming up? Or
Oh, yes. I should have included that. www.niddk.nih.gov will take you to the NIDDK webpage, and there's a link there called Current Initiatives that lists all the program announcements and all the requests for applications that are current, for which we're accepting applications.
Like for next study,
Mm-hmm.
we were told, and I don't know how true it is, do you ever release that information outside of your organization? What I'm getting at is that, say we have a family, we have one person that has FSGS, but yet we do the genetic studies, somebody else in our family might have that marker. We were told the future could help impact life insurance and health insurance of that individual person. So my question is, if we do the genetic study, is there any way that information would be leaked out?
Not if it's part of a research protocol, no. I mean, part of what you'll sign, if you're having that done as part of a research study in the consent form, there is always a clause about patient confidentiality. So it's not something that should just be available to the general public, no. Yes?
As a not, off the record is a government official to address stem cell research.
Oh, gosh. Off the record. You know, obviously there are a limited number of lines that the administration has okayed. And we now know that several of those lines don't work. Personally, I do not have a problem with stem cell research. And we do fund stem cell research. It's just, if you're talking human embryonic cells, that's where we get into limitations. We have a lot of grants that are using stem cells in other animal models, not so much in human stem cells because of the limitations that have been imposed. So what happens is, if you've got a good protocol, you have to find your funding elsewhere. You know, it's something that's completely out of our hands. And people who send in applications have to specifically address whether or not human embryonic stem cells are going to be used in their research, and if so, which lines, because then it's verified whether or not it's one of the approved lines. And it's unfortunately, again, one of these things that advocacy could probably make a difference over time. Okay, thank you.